Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Learning Lab's webinar series. I'm Lark Park. I'm the director of the Learning Lab, and we are really excited to introduce the second in our webinar series, Deploying Learning Assistants Online, Tips from Learning Assistant Instructors. So for any of you who joined us last time, and for new participants, we're really trying to get while the getting is good before fall instruction completely takes over everybody's lives. And for some of you, it's probably already taken over, but we wanted to get in a few webinars that we thought could add value as you're thinking about remote instruction and online teaching and learning in the fall. So I just wanted to make a little plug that in addition to the one that we have for today, we have one on August 21st called Shazbot, Can You Really Do Active, Adaptive, Asynchronous Learning All at the Same Time? And then we have another one on August 26th called Don't Be a Robot, Lessons on How and Why to Humanize Online Teaching. So please watch out for those. And then we'll take a breather like everybody is going to be focused on launching their courses until late September. But for today's topic, I'm really excited to introduce Laura Rios and Stamatis Vokas from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, which happens to be our program analyst Beth Hotchkiss's alma mater. Go Mustangs, I think, is the right mascot. But they are part of the Mechanics of Inclusion team led by PI Brian Self at Cal Poly, Dom Dalballo at Allen Hancock College, and Danielle Harlow at UC Santa Barbara. So Laura recently joined Cal Poly from the University of Colorado at Boulder. She has a PhD in physical chemistry from UC Irvine and a BA in chemistry from Oberlin College. Among one of her early published works, I think in 2011, was the intriguing title From Folklore to Molecular Pharmacopoeia. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right. Cultivating STEM Students Among Young First-Generation Female Mexican Americans. That one looks interesting. I'd like to read that. Stamatis Vokas comes to Cal Poly by way of Seattle Pacific University, University of Cyprus, University of Washington, and potentially other places as well. He was trained in physics at both the University of Kent in the UK and at UC Berkeley, and he's done extensive work in physics education among his other accomplishments. So in briefly introducing these two generous faculty members, and I say generous because they were generous with their time in order to do this webinar, I wanted to highlight a couple of memorable things about each of them. So I asked them to tell me something funny or a fun fact about themselves. So according to Laura, her least favorite type of math operation is a contour integral because you don't actually integrate anything at all. And she says, and I quote, "It's a heinous lie." So this tells us that we better be careful. If you meet Laura in a dark alley, you better be precise, is what I take that. According to Stamatis, he has a claim to fame, which is also a claim to shame. And I'm not going to get this right, Stamatis, but you can embellish as you see fit. Stamatis at one point had the opportunity to take a picture with the Dalai Lama. And he was very excited about this, and he wanted to be really prepared for what would be a great, maybe even seminal moment for him. And so he rehearsed in terms of how he's going to act or pose or conduct himself. So when the moment arrived, and this picture was not a selfie, to his great chagrin, the picture revealed a 6'1" Stamatis towering over the 5'7" Dalai Lama, which it turns out is a serious no-no. Like, you never do that. So I'm not sure where this picture hangs, Stamatis. It might hang on your wall of fame, or it might hang on your wall of shame. You can keep it as a secret. But without further ado, I want to give you over to the Mechanics of Inclusion team. So Stamatis, take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you all for joining us today. This is a great opportunity for us peer-to-peer to share some of the work that we've been doing and how it is connected to other national work. We are going to be talking about deploying learning assistants today. And if we think about, first of all, what is the learning assistant model? And we'll assume that at least some of you are intrigued about learning assistants and do not know everything that there is to know about learning assistants. And so the traditional model, Laura, if you do not mind going to the next slide. The traditional model of instruction, which is the SAB model of instruction, is where you have one instructor and you have lots and lots and lots of students, and you have these unidirectional arrows while we pretend as instructors that we are actually communicating knowledge from our minds to their minds. Whereas the learning assistant model is a model that recognizes that learning is fundamentally a social endeavor. And so you see these pods of the students working together, and we'll talk about what kind of work that is. And that work among groups of students is facilitated by several learning assistants. And so the instructor, of course, there is still involved in all aspects of that interaction, but we recognize that true learning in STEM happens in this collaborative way. The LA model is based on the LA experience is essentially has three parts, and we're going to spend some time thinking about each one of those parts. Well, first of all, there is a weekly content prep meeting where the LAs, these are peers of the students who are in the course. Maybe they're just one semester ahead, as little as one semester ahead. These are undergraduate students. And so the LAs at the weekly prep meeting, they reflect on the past week and they prepare for what is coming in the context of the topical area of the week. And they're being prepared as learners. They work through special materials. So I think that is something that is very important to be said from the very beginning, is that you cannot take a course and just throw in LAs in a standard course. You need to be thinking about what kind of materials students are going to be working on, what kind of activities. Is there a reason, is there a benefit to students to working together? Because if somebody can actually work through the materials by themselves, there is no benefit to working together in groups. And then they plan strategies and they also practice with each other questions, as we're going to see. We have three wonderful learning assistants with us, and you will have some chance to interact with them in breakout rooms. And they also examine student work and they discuss about what are the difficulties of students. Secondly, there is a concurrent enrollment of the LAs, at least for the first, at Cal Poly, for the first two times that somebody serves as an LA, in a special course, which is the LA Seminar course, where they learn about questioning strategies, they learn about a little bit about cognitive science, they learn a little bit about the student difficulties, they learn about how to elicit ideas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, there is the third part, which is, of course, where the rubber meets the road, and that is the work with their peers in the classroom. And so the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to start by describing a little bit about what happens at the weekly learning assistant prep meeting. So these are absolutely crucial meetings. I remember when I was a graduate student at UC Berkeley many years ago, we never had this ongoing preparation. Of course, now many things have changed. And so this is an ongoing formal part where LAs develop their, in addition to their content knowledge, they also develop their pedagogical content knowledge and their curricular content knowledge. They revisit whatever is coming up this week for the students in the class, they revisit it as learners. But they also do something that is very different that a student in the class does not do. They sort of deconstruct the curriculum. They could deconstruct the activity. What is the purpose of the activity? What is the logic of the activity? Then they anticipate student ideas. And of course, with the more experience or the more readings there are about research-based readings about what research on the learning and teaching of the discipline has uncovered about those ideas, so much better prepared a learning assistant is going to be. They practice how to elicit those ideas. And then they learn when to intervene and when to let discussion develop in the context of that activity. So that is something which is different topic by topic. And then they also practice asking probing questions in a situation, which happens quite often, but for which we have built in support structure for the learning assistants. And that is that the learning assistants are not expected to be content experts. So they develop questioning strategies to employ when they themselves are not sure of the canonically correct answers. So we're going to move on now to the content prep simulation. So Laura.
Thanks. Okay, hi everyone, I'm Laura. One thing I want to reiterate from what Samada said, right, is that, you know, as content experts yourselves, I think we sort of get, like, we kind of focus in on that, like, oh yeah, let's teach the LAs all the content. But as you can kind of see, it's a little bit more of a complex learning endeavor that they're involved in. And that's something that we kind of want to practice, because I know that sometimes that could be tricky. And so here's what we're going to do. We're going to go into breakout rooms for example, you might have your students go into breakout rooms to work on an activity together. And we're going to show you a typical physics learning assistant facilitated activity. We realize that you probably come from a variety of backgrounds, so if you can't go back and dust off the cobwebs from intro physics, that's totally okay, because remember, you're like, as students are saying that for the first time as well. And so our role-playing scenario is that you are a learning assistant in a content prep meeting, and our senior LAs and some of us, so I think Ben and Stamatis, and I think Brian as well, will kind of act as like lead LAs or lead instructors during the content prep meeting. And so so to give you an idea of what you'll be sort of looking at is, again, this is very typical sort of sense-making example from introductory physics, where we kind of think a little bit about what are student ideas that they might first encounter with a very real physical scenario. So again, all of our LAs have this for you, so you don't have to memorize it now. You'll see it in a little bit. I just wanted to give you a flavor now. And so again, let's not necessarily get bogged down in the content. That's sort of like the one part that we know you're experts in, you know how to do it. Let's focus on the second part, which is sort of really trying to understand how do we elicit student ideas and how to engage with them, because that's really where the LAs shine and where it's a little bit more complex and difficult. So the two things we'd like for you to tackle in your breakout rooms are the following questions. So discuss what ideas do you anticipate students will come up with in trying to solve that problem. And in fact, they might be your own ideas, depending on your background, if you're also trying to make sense of that in real time. And then think about, how would I question a student to elicit those ideas? I think a lot of the time students are not used to, they don't think of it. Actually, a learning assistant of mine recently putting in this grade, they don't associate talking with learning. And so we have to kind of really encourage them to like talk and see it as a learning endeavor. So what things would you say to them? What questions would you ask to really get them, like draw out all of their good ideas and how to engage with them? And so again, I'll just briefly mention, so Abby Lindquist will be an LA. Lana Lauria will also be an LA there. Juan Tolento are all fabulous senior LAs. And again, Ben Lutz and Brian Self and Samara Sokos will be all going out into breakout rooms to help facilitate that. So as your ideas are kind of like, as your discussion is starting to converge, maybe try to think of like a speaker for the group, and maybe just take a few preliminary notes, and then be prepared to kind of share out one idea from the breakout room to the larger group when we come back together. Depending on the time, we might share it out verbally, or we might ask you to type it in the chat. Let's take no more than 10 minutes in the breakout rooms. So I'll pause here, let maybe our thoughts catch up with us for a couple seconds and see if there are any questions. Oh, okay. Okay, I have to make quickly. All right, okay, so I have to do some maneuvering in the breakout room. So maybe if your thoughts are still catching up with you, there's still a few more seconds while I figure out the breakout rooms.
So one thing that I wanted to mention is that we also, as I look at the participants, we also have folks in the list of participants who have quite a bit of experience themselves involving LAs. And so Pete Schwartz, for instance, has a lot of experience. And so in the breakout room, Pete can also serve as a senior LA. Facilitating the conversation. Emily Walter knows a lot about the Learning Assistant program, and I'm sure that there are others who actually have a lot of experience as well.
And I just wanted to note, at least from Josh, there is somebody who's having trouble with the registration. So I don't know if there are folks who are having trouble getting in or getting on. But in any case, hopefully they'll be able to come on and we can add them to the breakout rooms.
I was going to say, I'll stay outside and then I'll see if people come in and I can add them to breakout rooms as they come in.
Great.
All right, ready team, go.
Okay, hi everyone again. I'm Juan. As I mentioned, I was in LA for several years back at my time at Cal Poly. You all can see my screen, I trust, hopefully.
Could you make it bigger, please?
Yeah, of course. Okay, there we go.
Perfect.
So yeah, this is the question we're going to be looking at. Timmy's fallen down a well, and again, it's not really necessarily like the content that we're going to be looking at, but it's more so what types of techniques would you use to help a student, or what kind of questions do you think they would have when faced with a question, and what answers would you give them when they ask you those questions. So oftentimes when I was in LA, students would come up to me all the time and just ask, is this right? To which the only response I ever gave was, I don't know. Sometimes I did know, sometimes I didn't. It's not really the point. So yeah, I'm going to give you all a second to read the question and then kind of just think about what type of student ideas would come up from, yeah, what ideas do you expect students might have, and how would you expect to help them, whether they have the correct answer or the incorrect answer.
So I'm assuming that the students would already know that newtons are force.
Right, yeah, and that's also like a really big thing, the assumptions you make on what they do already know and what they don't already know. But yeah.
I'm sorry, I missed my headphone did something funny there. Mary, I think Mary spoke. I did not quite hear exactly what you assumed. You said, I assume that student something, Newton something.
I'm gonna put my other mic on. Hold on.
No. It was my thing. It was my thing. It was not you.
Okay. Okay. I'm assuming that they know the units. It's newtons for force.
And yes.
Pounds. You know that they would know that there was a difference with the pounds.
Yes, you're absolutely right.
I might. A student might ask, is there going to be some friction on the side of the well? Is that what you're having us do? Are we thinking out loud? Are we? Is that?
Yeah. Please think out loud, because everything. I mean, what we are assuming here is we're assuming that people are going to have ideas, and that is the beautiful thing: is people are going to have ideas, and so a learning assistant should be prepared to deal with any idea that comes up. And so, yeah, so you are saying, I wonder if there is friction against the wall, right? I wonder if there is friction against the wall. then another question that you said might come up is, I'm not sure what newtons are. I thought that when we talk about weight, we're talking about pounds. So pounds versus newtons. Sure, absolutely. What are other ideas that you think students?
A student might ask whether whether the child, the weight is when they're just their normal weight, or if they're wet, like if that adds weight to the child.
So, clarifications, I guess, clarifications about the meaning of weight, right? Clarifications about the meaning of weight.
And so like the rope, is the rope figured into the weight? And we have to take
rope
into account the rope losing weight when it comes up?
Exactly. So you have less rope as you're pulling up because all that rope is lying on the ground right now. And so then, so what are the assumptions there? Excellent. Excellent. How about somebody else who would like to share?
I'm looking at the question and it says constant speed. And so I know there's force. Force is mass times acceleration, if I remember right, from a long time ago in physics. So the constant speed thing is confusing me, I guess. Like, or I'm just not ready to make that jump.
Exactly. So you bring some prior knowledge about the material, and you say, well, I don't understand how they can be pulling without they be speeding up or something, because that is what I was expecting formally. Got it. Excellent. And so there are analogs, right? There are analogs of this in any discipline, in any course. And so I'm sure that you all come from different disciplinary perspectives, and clearly what we wanted to do is we wanted to pick some context. But Juan, I wonder, what do you think might be an idea, student idea, that would come up in this context?
I wasn't necessarily thinking about like this context specifically, but I like these types of problems where you have, specifically part B, you have greater than, less than, or equal to. I think when LAs are trying to get, or when they're getting together and talking, I think it's really good to spend some time making a case for each of them, because at the end of the day, you know, the students aren't going to have the right answer, and they're going to have some type of explanation for each of those cases, greater than, equal to, or less than, and only at the end of the day, only one of those is correct. So I think making a case for each of them, and then trying to think of scenarios that are similar to this, but something that maybe students are a little bit more familiar with, so that way you kind of have that tool in your back pocket, so that when the LAs are in the classroom and they're interacting with students, and the student says, you know, they pick greater than, or they pick less than, or they pick equal to, regardless, you're more or less prepared to take on that scenario, that you prepared to the point where you could, you know, you're not caught off guard with, oh, I was expecting them to have the correct answer and I don't know what to do now.
So what I'm hearing you say is that you are approaching the questions by assuming that there is in the guts of each one of those possible answers, even though only one of them is canonically correct. But in the guts of each one, there are reasons. People think what they think because there are reasons for what they think, right? Even if even if that idea turns out to be canonically incorrect. And the LA needs to be prepared to be thinking about something, not just I'm thinking about this in a canonical way, the correct way, but I'm also know enough in order to get into somebody else's head and think about how they might think about this, which is something which is a very challenging task, as you would all agree, I think, as experienced educators. The other kind of thing that I heard Juan say is that there are, an LA needs to know other scenarios. so that that sort of highlight the same kind of ideas in order to try out with the students and say, oh, have you thought about what would happen in that other case? What would happen? So an LA needs to have those scenarios in their pocket when they go into the class. I guess we are being summoned, and we're going to be yanked abruptly in 22 seconds back into the room. And so these are the kinds of things that are discussed in the content prep that, as you can see, go way beyond what is the right answer to this question. And so each one of these activities needs to be broken down into that. So I think we're all back.
Okay, great. So I think the fact that it took everyone the whole minute to wrap up is a really positive sign that there was a lot of great discussion in there. And since we do have a bit of time, I was hoping that maybe we could do a little bit of a large group share out. And of course, if you're not comfortable doing a large group chat, you can always type in the chat some of the ideas that you came up with. And so I guess I'll open it up for a little bit of just like a large group discussion about maybe I'll start off with like, what was the hardest thing about kind of shifting from purely content, let's get this answer right, to like, let's talk a little bit more meta level, more content about how do we elicit student ideas. Does anyone want to share something that they maybe like struggled with and like shifting a little bit that focus?
We actually never tried to solve the problem.
Okay, that's great.
We had exquisite LAing. We didn't even say we have to solve the problem.
Fantastic. It looks like Tim raised his hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, I really liked the problem. It took us maybe 9 minutes to, what I think, get to the meat of the issue, which had to do with deceleration and all. Because in my analytical mind, I kept worrying about if there was friction on the rope and how the experiment was designed, if the rope was hanging over the edge of the lip of the well and all that sort of stuff. So I think if the question had been worded more precisely, I really enjoyed hearing the answer that, you know, at the end, it was sort of I think it would be a surprise to some of the students. So 9 minutes to sort of set the stage and then 1 minute to get the aha moment.
Mm-hmm. And I guess I'm wondering, like, since you said like something about the precision of the language, in what ways do you think you could use that to elicit more ideas about what students might think? And this is not just a question for you, Tim, for anyone else that maybe wanted to comment on that.
Well, I'll just say very quickly, when you ask a question on a test or a quiz, or in this case, a problem, there can be issues where you have to judge how many words you want to expend and how much, how well you phrase a question. And if you get too detailed, then some students are going to lose the main purpose of the exercise. So in this case, while it's useful maybe to have the students diagram things with maybe force vectors, if it's laid out beforehand, then there might not be as much time devoted to figuring out what the problem is really asking.
Okay, so I think what I'm hearing is that the students need to understand the problem in addition to the solution. Yeah. Okay, and maybe I would like to invite any of our senior LAs to make a comment either on the ways that they have experienced eliciting student ideas. I think in particular this tutorial they have a lot of experience with, not to put you on the spot. So if you wanted to share a gem of wisdom for everybody, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I remember I had like a conversation pretty much exactly like this with you, Laura, right? In the classroom, where a lot of the students were complaining like, the questions are worded weird, and you know, a lot of them were making comments about the language that was used to describe the situations and the questions. And you said something along the lines of like, it makes them really think about what is being asked of them and what they really need to consider, which is a big part of solving problems in physics. It's like, you know, what parameters do I need to actually think about that aren't stated in the question, and what parameters do they give me that aren't really helpful? So I thought that was a really, really good way of putting it, and it really actually changed my mind on a lot of the wording and the language that was used in the tutorials as well.
Okay, thanks for sharing that, Lana. Yeah, for sure. I think sometimes like that struggle can be very productive, or, you know, even if they hate it in the moment. Okay, so again, if you want to share some of your thoughts in the chat and like have a little bit of a side discussion while I'm over here rambling, that's fantastic. That's what I do in my class. I'm like, if I'm talking, you're not learning. So go ahead and chat as you'd like. So I think that probably there was a variety of experiences in the breakout rooms. And I think something that the LAs ask me a lot is, well, what happens if I don't know the answer? And, you know, that happens to me as an instructor all the time. Like, or maybe I need to like chew on something, right? And so the LAs also, so now we want to transition to that third part of the LA experience, the LA seminar, or the preparation and pedagogy. And I guess I'll state that there's a lot of discussion that happens. So here at Cal Poly, we have our LAs take the LA seminar the first 2 times that they are learning assistants. And we do encourage others who are taking up the LA model to really engage their students with the preparation and pedagogy, because there is a lot of, I think, habit forming around being in LA versus being something like a tutor, right? That is kind of different for them. And so I will be making all of the materials and resources, some of which I will make just brief allusions to during the rest of this brief webinar, available to you either via email through Beth or on our OPR website. Okay, so I kind of split up the LA Pedagogy Seminar into 2 parts. One I call Tools for Your Back Pocket, because obviously when we're in the moment, there's a student with a question, maybe we don't know how to answer, maybe we do, but we don't want to just give the student the answer, right? We want to have them engage with their own ideas and with our ideas. So we need to have like sort of what we call talking moves, right, or talking tools. So they're really about how to facilitate the discussion, right? They're not there necessarily to explain content. That's what we're there for. And then also questioning strategies. And I use a lot from a talk science primer, the goals for productive discussions and 9 talk moves. And so these 9 talk moves, I don't have them all listed here, but they're really about like, what is the goal here? And the goal is always to center the student learning, to make sure that the student themselves is in the driver's seat. And again, I will be posting all of these resources somewhere where everyone can find them and see them. And so some of our LAs here were my students as well, so they probably are very familiar with the infamous, oh, can you tell me more about that? And I think that, again, with that language problem that like Lana and Tim brought up, even just saying like, say more things, like you'll be surprised how many more things that you'll get students to say. And I think sometimes LAs resist doing that because they want to be able to explain right away. But that's, again, not like our goal necessarily as LAs. The goal is to get the students in the driver's seat of their learning. So another, and then sort of on the level of the instructor, what does that mean? So the fact that the LAs are given these sort of tools for your back pocket, what does that mean for us as instructors? And I think Stamatis made an allusion to this in the beginning, right, is that because we're training them to foster collaborative group work, we have to provide a meaningful task for our students and for our LAs to be involved in. And again, I took some of the language from Productive Group Work, which is a short article that I have my LAs read, and it'll be available to everyone, right, where they talk about 5 principles of collaborative learning. What does that look like? Sorry, cooperative learning, what does that look like? And then they add a 6th one, which is that meaningful task, and say, well, why? It's like, well, you know, when you have like a looming problem, that's like, it's wrestling with the task together that makes it the actual learning experience that we want them to have, right? Tackling something that only really a group of minds could tackle versus like, well, I could have just tackled this by myself. But we're kind of showing them like, there's something about having multiple brains working on this that really facilitates learning for everyone across the board. Sometimes students say like, well, what if a student is slightly ahead or slightly behind? Well, for that student that's slightly ahead, we train our LAs to say, how do you get them to now be your, like delegate to them your LAs and bring the sort of students who maybe are a little bit behind forward. And that becomes, again, a sort of like positive feedback loop, but like a collaborative thing. And in a way, we find that some of this group work can be greater than the sum of its parts. And then the sort of second part of the LA seminar is really about education research. So physics education research is my current field of study, and also kind of pedagogy philosophy to kind of get them the sense of what is the motivation for the LA model. So it's a model for a reason, because we didn't want people to have these very strict curricula, right? They have to have some institutional or contextual flexibility. And so part of that is to kind of say, well, what are some of the broader theories involved in creating the LA model? And so, again, it's sort of like getting them to understand, why is it that LAs facilitate discussions and not just explain ideas? And so we do toss at them quite a number of things that I think could be really like at a variety you can engage with for a long time. So I talked to them about Bloom's taxonomy, from which we get ideas of what types of questions do you want to ask? Do you want to ask synthesis questions or analysis questions? Maybe the students aren't quite there yet, so you just ask them for apprehension type questions. I talked to them about cognitive apprenticeship, which actually many instructors do naturally, many experienced instructors do naturally. I'm sure all of you on this call do cognitive apprenticeship, where you kind of model and scaffold for your students, not just what you do, but what you're thinking of, right? Like, okay, when I'm solving this problem, when I'm tackling this problem, I think to myself, X, Y, Z. And so very experienced instructors do this naturally, but it's good. I like to show it to the LAs, because then it kind of gives them a sort of a deliberative view of what it means. Like, you were kind of collapsing all of that experience into one thing by giving it a name. We talk about metacognition, which is just thinking about thinking, which is like a really fun thing that I spent a lot of time talking to the LAs about, because I think they got kind of stuck on where that is. And of course, mental models, which is really where that eliciting student ideas comes from. It's like, we need to know what your mental model is of friction or tension or whatever your content may be, in order to start there, start with that idea and then kind of keep going forward. And then I guess like the one that I don't know if it's controversial, but it's one that like a lot of people kind of still debate, is this idea of constructivism versus positivism. And of course I'm putting it as a versus, but it could be and there's obviously a spectrum. And so just for fun, I would like to play with you guys a game that I play with my LAs. And for some of my LAs, I play with them all year. I'm still playing with some of them. Okay, so here's the game. So define a chair in such a way that your definition has to exclude all non-chairs. So why don't we take a couple seconds to think, and then maybe you can type in the chat your definition if you're comfortable, or you could just write it down for yourself. I'll give us all maybe like a minute. Okay. Okay, so I'm seeing some things that are about like the features of the chair, the purpose of the chair. There's some intentionality, which is interesting. Okay, maybe like a couple more seconds for people to write in if they'd like. Oh, design. Oh, it needs a seat back, otherwise it's a stool. So is the seat back the thing that makes it a chair? Okay, cool, I love this. Okay, these are all very common definitions. Okay, so based off of your definition, and you can still keep thinking about it, based off of your definition is, let's maybe do a quick show of hands. Is this a chair? It has to be according to your definition, not what you think right now. Okay, Brian shook his head, okay. Thanks. Okay. How about, is this a chair? Yeah, we're getting some head shakes. Okay, is this a chair? I hope not. I would say that this is an opposite of a chair. Okay, is this a chair? So someone said, no, this is not a chair. It's got no back, so not a chair. Okay, is this a chair? This like bucket seat type of thing? And then my favorite one, because my students often say like, we go. And then I say, oh, okay, it's got legs and a back and you sit on it. So I'm like, cool, this is a chair. It's got legs and a back and you sit on it. Okay, so thank you for playing this game with me. It's one of my, I'm a very cheesy professor. So why I play this game with them is because at the end, we kind of go like, again, I have to say strictly from your definition, is this a chair? But usually with some of these, my students will say like, well, no, this is a chair because we agree that it is a chair. Like we have all here agreed that it is a chair. We probably can't know the chair in its like authentic chairness. And so, whoops. And so I guess the idea here is that I really want the students to kind of get to know constructivism outside the jargon and the whatever, and even these silly webinars, but to kind of say like, this is what it means. This is what social construction of knowledge means, is that we are kind of all agreeing. And yeah, the definitions had things like features, had things like purpose, had things like design. There was one where it's like, okay, it's like when you go from, you're not standing anymore. So that's like an area where you're no longer standing, right? So there's like a negative definition part there. And all of that has been like socially constructed. And at least for physics majors, sometimes it's difficult for them to wrap their brains around because we are dealing with facts. Socially constructed knowledge doesn't mean that there are no facts in the world, right? It just means that how we came to understand those facts was sort of socially constructed. And that way it kind of gives them that motivation of, this is why we do group work, because it very authentically reflects that social construction of knowledge. Okay, so with that, thank you for letting me go off on like the tangent that I love to go on. So with all of that said, we talked about content preparation, we talked about pedagogy, we talked about what is a chair. And so you as an instructor, what does that mean for you as, what should your LAs be doing during the class? So again, we kind of went out to breakout sessions as LAs might do and then kind of be in charge. And so the LAs should be sort of monitoring the chats and the hand raising. And so for that, like, you could make them co-hosts of the Zoom session. And I would suggest that you practice this with them ahead of time. I realize there are many constraints on everyone's time, but this is a really positive way to get the students feeling, or sorry, the LAs some ownership of the process. And so dovetailing into that is another thing that students should kind of be doing, or you should be seeing, is that LAs should be mediating the discussion and also disrupting problematic behavior. So in education research, while we often exalt all the great things of collaborative work, the sort of slight bug in there is that sometimes group work, you see more microaggressions or students coming into conflict. But the LAs, once they're empowered by you to really take charge of that space, right, can be empowered to either mute people or kick people out, or like just help mediate discussion and kind of keep conflict to a minimum and make sure that it's about learning. Okay, and also someone made a mention of this in chat, so I'm having a hard time keeping track of the chat, but someone said something about like, oh, let's like focus on the struggle of learning. And I would say, yes, I think learning is uncomfortable. It's a struggle. And I think one really positive thing the LAs can be doing during the class is they're their peers with them, and sometimes only 1 or 2 years ahead. And so they could say, oh yeah, the time that I looked at this, it made no sense, but then I took the next dynamics course or something like that, and like it all kind of clicked together. So like, come on board with me. And so I think, again, and this is really about the space that you as an instructor give the LAs. I think kind of telling them like, it's okay to not just be like a robot that dispenses answers. You can be in peership with them. You can talk to them about your own struggle. You can just elicit ideas and have a discussion with them. Really helps create a really positive atmosphere, which is extra important in virtual learning, where we can kind of feel a little robotic or stilted. And so to summarize, really what you should be observing during your breakout rooms or during your classes is an active exchange of ideas and not necessarily a tutoring session. I think that is something that we kind of fall into because it's the easy thing to transmit the content that we know, right? But getting us to kind of engage and talk about each other's ideas is the hard part. Okay, so I kind of mentioned, okay, let's see what time it is. So I kind of mentioned that again, like the role that you play as an instructor can help the LA kind of really come into that positive role. And I did a very brief, I guess not that brief, but I did some research with a undergraduate student who is in LA and a future physics teacher. And we found that one of the most beneficial things instructors can do with their LAs is have like a purposeful reflection period with them. So the LAs would talk about how they would talk to the instructors after class about a variety of topics, including the content, but then also just like, what is your role? How can I help like you fit in better and stuff like that? And just seeing the LAs grow through that reflection period, like it's really one of those things where you put in 10 or 15 minutes and you get a huge like return on investment on that time. And so really it's about things that you can also learn as an instructor from that reflection period. The things that the instructors and the LAs reported that they were learning about were, you get a better sense of what are your students learning about conceptually. I think in a physical classroom, we can kind of walk around and eavesdrop, but in our breakout rooms are sort of done, right? And so having that reflection period with our LAs can let us know, oh, here's where my students are at. Maybe they need a little bit extra time on cellular respiration. Maybe they need a little more time on the Kantian imperative, you know, depending on your content. And then what are the ideas that students are sort of doing well on? And maybe you could say, oh, okay, maybe I can like rush through that and get to the next thing, right? So I think they have like a more like boots on the ground understanding sometimes of where the students are at. So that's something that you can learn as an instructor from that reflection period as well. And then one thing that the LAs, again, like, it's about like empowering and having a sense of ownership too, right? Like if you foster like a good feedback mechanism, sometimes LAs have really good ideas about which instructional practices are really helpful. And I know Lana was instrumental for me improving my class as a first-time instructor, right? She really was able to tell me like, oh, that didn't go over well, you know, like, oh, maybe try this, you know, like, and so that is a really super powerful experience as an instructor, to kind of see like from the student perspective what is working in real time. And then, of course, it's very powerful and informative for the LAs as well. So the sorts of things that LAs can learn from that deliberate reflection period is, you know, what are things that they can do better in the future to respond to questions, right? They might ask you like, oh, I had this problem and like I kind of answered it in this way, but it doesn't feel. But obviously, you as a content expert could say, how about this example, or how about this other problem, right? And then they can bring that back in with the students. And then what we're seeing is that the LAs are also coming to a more nuanced and complex understanding of their learning and teaching. And so, again, that was all sort of, so that was all sort of a part of like a research experience I had with a LA. And so here, I just want to take a little bit of time. I know that sometimes like we don't build a lot of reflection in our time. We're very busy people, but I think, again, I think there's a huge return on investment that I do encourage you to undertake if you would like. So here's just some questions that I think that you can start off with, right? If it feels kind of weird to just be like, let's reflect. You know, you can talk about what is a really positive exchange that you had with a student and what were some characteristics of that exchange that made it good that we can replicate in the future. And you can ask them straightforwardly, like, what is some content you think students are struggling with? And then go further, like, what's the nature of that struggle, right? Like, again, in the tension, like, oh, is it just the vector notation that's a problem, or is it actually like an idea with tension that we need to work with? And then also maybe say like, what other material do you think they need? Because sometimes they might say, you might, you know, and just to get things started. So in the spirit of reflection, and we're about near the end of where we're about this webinar, let's take a little bit of time to reflect. So I think it would be positive for us to take a few seconds to think about times that reflecting on our instructional practices has been positive. And maybe if you would like, you can drop in the chat or write down to yourself some other questions that you say, oh, this would be a really positive jumping off point for me to reflect with my LAs after class. So again, I'll be quiet for like 10 seconds. Okie dokie. All right, so again, I guess like the conclusion there would be to like also like help your LAs like come into that role with you, of like really step into there. Okay, so for the next part, I think Samaris will take over for a bit to kind of like really drive the message home about all the positive impacts LAs can have. Okay, go ahead, Samaris. You're muted, Samaris.
Oh, sorry. One could ask, what are the benefits of LA facilitated courses? And so we're going to be talking about three kinds of benefits. Impact on students, impact on the students in the courses that are facilitated by LAs, impact on the LAs themselves, and impact on the institution. And so I will just spend 2 minutes sharing with you just a very small bit of the data that exists. There are papers that we can relate to. We can talk then at the very end about the local data and that kind of thing. So as you can see here is that you have that students who take on a traditional intro course as first years without that course being facilitated by LAs on a particular nationally administered conceptual inventory do according to the leftmost what do we call that? To the leftmost column, exactly. And then what happens is that when you compare those students with students who are taking the same class, but a class which is facilitated by LAs, then the students in that class actually have learned much, much more. And finally, what we see is that the LAs who have served as LAs, the students who have served as LAs, actually learn the most. And so if we go to the next, slide, if we look at the left hand diagram, we actually find exactly the same information. Students with LAs, students without LAs, and then so students with LAs are the yellow average. The red average are students in classes with LAs, and the green one are LAs after they have been LAs in the class. And then you have the graduate TAs, which are out there. So one kind of criterion that you could use for student learning is that if you can get your undergraduate students to perform at the same level as graduate students in the discipline, then those students, the introductory students, have actually learned a lot. The other kind of thing, the last thing that I wanted to share about this is that you can also see this not just in physics or in chemistry, but the LA model has actually been now expanded to more than 90 different departments. And so you have LAs in economics, you have LAs in genetics, you have LAs in all kinds of different kinds of things. The last slide for me is the following. We can think about, this is something similar of what I already mentioned before, that LAs actually learn. Let's go to the last one. And that is, what is the benefit to the institution? And so there are additional benefits, not just the students in the class learn and the LAs learn, but also institutions that have instituted LA programs have seen increases in the numbers of prospective STEM teachers. And that is something which is absolutely crucial. In disciplines like physics, where we have a huge national problem of physics teacher education, the LA program is a mechanism for recruiting more teachers. And then at the institutional level, LA programs serve as wonderful context for professional development of faculty. And the LAs themselves, because they serve as this mediating agent, they actually are agents of reforming teaching and learning in ways that are more inclusive, more equitable, so that more students from all walks get to learn. So I think this is it, and we're going to open this up to questions. Is that correct? And here are our email addresses. And so if you would like any specific information, if it can be of any help whatsoever, I'm sure that you have oodles of questions about nuts and bolts. You know, how do I get an LA program up and running? How do I sustain it? All of that kind of stuff. I think that is really great. What are your questions?
Modest, I'd like to just make a point that so my LAs were just a real great asset for me. They stayed after every class, like I'd finish the class on Zoom and they'd stick around. And, you know, I didn't feel alone anymore teaching a class. Like they were there, they were my, you know, my people, you know. They'd give me feedback on how things went. They'd suggest things. They'd say this didn't work well. One of the things they did was they were like, yeah, the students didn't like this, or the students really liked this. So stuff that students would never tell me, they would tell the LAs, and the LAs would relate to me. So that to me was potentially the most valuable thing that I saw in the process. So just saying.
Absolutely, absolutely. I could not agree more with you, Pete. I wanted to elevate Jules' comment here about the fact that who should you tap on the shoulder to be an LA? Does that need to necessarily be an A student? And the fact is that some of our LAs are A students, like the LAs that we have on the call today. But that is by no means a requirement for having somebody to be a good LA. You want other kinds of things. You want people who are intellectually empathetic, who can think from different perspectives, who are interested in other people's ideas, who are fine with confusion, who'd love to learn. And so all of those, intangible qualities are absolutely crucial. Brian, Ben, thoughts, Laura?
Yeah, I would just echo that. I think sometimes, yeah, like C students or I mean, and I think like even just talking about them as like C students can be, problematic in ways, but like they're able to articulate and normalize struggle, which is really an important part of this. I think, Laura had mentioned identity development and feeling like they belong. And I think that when you have an LA who can empathize with that struggle and really articulate what was hard specifically for them and how they got then past it, right? And be that positive role model, I think that's got a lot of power.
And I've also found that they, even as nice as we try to be, that we're still a little intimidating to students. So if you can give them that space to just have the LAs be there. And I even gave them space when we were talking about COVID or racial unrest last quarter, and I just would stay out and let them discuss. So it's really nice for them to have some of their peers for that space.
Well, great. Laura, Stamatis, and Brian and Ben, everybody from the Cal Poly team, I just want to say thank you for giving us a great presentation. We'll have this recorded. We'll make this available in case you want to forward it. Just a reminder not to forget about the 2 webinars that we have in August. And one thing, if you'll notice in Beth's chat before you leave, she's asked the question, what is the one thing you would share back at home about the LA model? And then separately, how can the team assist your efforts in creating a program? If you want to just respond before you leave about something that you might share, as well as if there's a way for the team to assist, I think that they would be more than happy to do so. So again, I just want to thank all of you for attending, and we really hope that you have a great start to the fall. Things are really very difficult, but I love the comment about the LAs being your people. I think Pete made that. I don't know if he's still on, but to me, that really captures what we need in the current moment. We need to feel some togetherness. So thank you so much, and we hope to see you at the next webinar. Bye, everyone.